Right, I will start things off. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Becky. I work at Edinburgh World Heritage, and I'm delighted to invite you to this evening's event, a celebration of the life of Sir Walter Scott on the 250th anniversary of his birth through a virtual tour of the old town of Edinburgh. Now, just before we kick things off, we've got a few notes of housekeeping. I'm sure that many of you are aware by now that many charities have lost significant amounts of income as a result of the pandemic over the past year or so. At Edinburgh World Heritage, we are making every effort to reduce costs so that our conservation and community work can continue, but we do also need to go on with fundraising events like this one. Now, one of the ways that you can support us is by becoming a member, and we extend a very warm welcome tonight to all of the new members joining us for the first time. Please visit our website, ewh.org.uk. The URL is on your screens at the moment, and the link is in the chat to find out more about our membership. You can also donate to us on our website as well, or via text. So you can text Edinburgh WH plus the amount you want to donate to 70450. So if you want to donate £10, for example, text Edinburgh WH10 to 70450. So the format for this evening is very simple, and we would like you to get involved by adding your own questions and thoughts on tonight's topic using the Zoom Q&A feature. As usual, your cameras and microphones are muted so that you can focus on our fantastic conversation we're going to have this evening. Now, we're delighted to introduce our special guest for tonight, Dr. Lucy Wood. She gained her PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2016 with a thesis entitled Fragments of the Past, Walter Scott, Material Antiquarianism and Writing as Preservation. Her thesis was awarded the Saltire Society's Ross Roy Medal in 2017, and in early 2018 she held the British Association for Romantic Studies Wordsworth Trust Early Career Fellowship researching William Wordsworth collections at Dove Cottage in Grathmere. Lucy is currently working at the Royal Collection Trust and has previously worked for Historic Environment Scotland, the Abbotsford Trust and the Mavis Bank Trust. So, on to the man of the evening. Son of an Edinburgh lawyer, himself a man of the law, at the age of 34, Walter Scott would publish his first wildly successful narrative poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. He then turned his hand at the age of 43 to novels, becoming the author of Waverley, the mysterious name by which he would be known until his identity was made public some years later. His presence in Edinburgh can be seen everywhere. It was his first novel, Waverley, which gives the Edinburgh Waverley train station its name, of course, and not far from the station, the Scott Monument, one of the largest monuments to any writer in the world, sits proudly on Princes Street with Scott at its centre, surveying the city for eternity, surrounded by statues of characters created or brought to life by his imagination. Scott can also be found in a significant spectrum of street names, and perhaps even more so in names of pubs. I wonder how he would feel about that. The Antiquary, the Kenilworth, the Abbotsford, Jeannie Dean's Tryst, to name but a few. Scott and his legacy are written into the very fabric of this city. Unsurprising, given that Scott's stories were inspired predominantly by Scottish history, people, places, and events. His writing, therefore, emerged from Scotland and Scotland's history from Edinburgh, from the stories of the city itself. Tonight, we're going to be exploring just some of the many sites connected to Scott and which gave him inspiration for his stories. Now, one of the most evocative descriptions of Edinburgh in Scott's writing can be found in Canto 4 of Marmion, his epic poem set around the time of the Battle of Culloden. Lord Marmion, in this excerpt, is approaching the city from the Blackford Hills and surveys the army of James IV below, with the city rising up behind. He writes, "Still on the spot Lord Marmion stayed, for fairer scene he ne'er surveyed. When sated with the martial show that peopled all the plain below, the wandering eye could o'er it go, and mark the distant city glow with gloomy splendour red. For on the smoke wreaths, huge and slow, that round her sable turrets flow, the morning beams were shed, and tinged them with a lustre proud, like that which streaks a thundercloud. Such dusky grandeur clothed the height where the huge castle holds its state, and all the deep slope down, whose ridgy back heaves to the sky, piled deep and massy, close and high, mine own romantic town.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Becky. So we're starting our tour, Nick here from Edinburgh World Heritage, at George Square, where Scott lived from when he was a young boy of 6 or 7 up until his marriage to Charlotte Carpentier in 1797. Scott was the 9th child of Anne Rutherford and Walter Scott, writer to the Signet. His mother was descended from the Haliburtons of Newmains, which gave the family the ancestral right to be buried at Dryburgh Abbey, where, of course, Scott was buried in 1832. His father was a borderer, descended from a line of Scots who could trace ancestry back to the 10th century and who had played a significant role in many years of turmoil which characterized the border region of Scotland during the Middle Ages, and which would provide such a source of inspiration for Scott across the course of his literary career. A writer to the Signet, Scott Sr. was, it seems, a stern man of a different temperament to his imaginative son. And although the two were to share a profession, their approach to the legal life and life more broadly speaking were very different, as we'll explore a little further in detail later on. So though the family lived at first in a close of the Old Town, when Scott was only a few years old, his father moved the family here to George Square. George Square was at the time a new and affluent area laid out in 1766 by James Brown, with the family moving just over a decade later. It was a gentrified suburb. It meant a move away from the claustrophobic confines and unsanitary spaces of the Old Town to a new neighborhood, altogether more healthy and wealthy, green and open. Scott's neighbours speak to this sense of wealth and status around the square, with residents including the Countess of Sutherland, Lord Braxfield, Justice Clerk of the Court, and Henry Dundas, the future Lord Melville. Later occupants continue in the literary tradition, with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle living just a few doors away, almost exactly 1 century later. So let's bring in Lucy at this point. And Lucy, tell us a little bit more about Scott's childhood in George Square and the way living there influenced his literary career.
Well, absolutely. Well, we know that from many of Scott's poems and novels that his surroundings, the places that he spends time in, really affect his writings and have a part to play in that. And George Square, I think, is no exception. His sort of literary inclinations are first perhaps stirred in this is one of the first venues where that happens. So it's actually here as well that we know that he first began collecting items, and he'd go on to become a famous collector, and that would be housed at his museum house in the Scottish borders at Abbotsford. But he began that collection even when he was a resident in his father's house in George Square, so when he was a very young man. And even some of these early objects would go on to inspire his fictions that would come on later. And here particularly his collections took the tenor of Jacobite objects and collections, and of course his first fiction, Waverley, takes that as the backdrop. And many of these objects and Scott's fascination as a young man with the Jacobite cause comes because one of the visitors to his father's house is a man named Alexander Stewart of Inverness, who was a Jacobite who took part in the 15 and the 45, and he would tell Scott stories about the Jacobites and battles, and really sort of well pitched for a young Scot. He was just all ears to that sort of tale. So we have a record that tells us at this time Scott was collecting objects connected with the Jacobites, and he says that because of this man, because of Alexander Stewart, he writes later in his life, I became a valiant Jacobite at the age of 10 years, which is just a lovely trace of that early dedication and early interest in objects to have. Great.
Okay, on to our next stop, Becky.
Thank you so much. So the next stop on our tour sees us take a step closer to the heart of the city and source for a great deal of Scott's inspiration. It's also a brief step back in time as we visit the site of Scott's birth on College Wynd. Walter Scott was born on 15th of August 1771 on College Wynd in Edinburgh's Old Town. this street, and on your screens you will see the memorial plaque high on the wall marking its illustrious past resident. However, this street no longer looks like the street of Scott's birth. In fact, the top section no longer remains at all, having given way to buildings of Chambers Street, which were added in the late 19th century, and the buildings of Old College. When Scott was born, this was a narrow, cramped, insanitary place like much of the old town. Even today, this bears stark contrast to the open greenery of George Square. So we can begin to understand the motives which would have spurred Scott Sr. to move his family away from what was a squalid and unsanitary place to live, even though it was an address shared by many of the city's professionals, including lawyers and academics. Not only was College Wynd worlds away from the greenery of George Square, it would have felt centuries apart from the modern grandeur of the Newtown, where Scott would himself take up residence on North Castle Street later in his life. Yet, Scott's earliest years weren't to be spent in the city of Edinburgh at all. Scott contracted polio when he was just 2 years of age, an illness which would mean he walked with a stick throughout the rest of his life. And his parents, fearful of losing another child, of their 12 children, only 6 survived to adulthood. They sent the young Scott far away from the stench of the city to Sandyknow Farm in Roxburghshire, which was the home of his paternal grandparents in the Scottish borders, for clean, good air and country living. So Lucy, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what we know about Scott's early years at Sandyknow, which we can see on our screens today.
Thank you. Well, yes, we know from his later writings about 2 really unusual occurrences during his time in the borders, and if you like, I can read those to you just now from his memoirs. An odd incident is worth recording. It seems my mother had sent a maid to take charge of me, that I might be no inconvenience in the family. But the damsel sent on that wild mission had left her heart behind her in the keeping of some wild fellow, it is likely, who had done and said more to her than he was like to make good. She became extremely desirous to return to Edinburgh, and as my mother made a point of her remaining where she was, she contracted a sort of hatred at poor me as the cause of her being detained at Sandyknow. This rose, I suppose, to a sort of delirious affection, for she confessed to old Alison Wilson, the housekeeper, that she had carried me up to the crags, meaning under a strong temptation to the devil, to cut my throat with her scissors and bury me in the moss. Alison instantly took possession of my person and took care that her confidant should not be subject to any further temptation so far as I was concerned. She was dismissed, of course, and I have heard that became afterwards a lunatic. It is here at Sandyknow, in the residence of my paternal grandfather, already mentioned, that I had the first consciousness of existence, and I recollect distinctly that my situation and appearance were a little whimsical. Among the old remedies recurred to aid my lameness, someone had recommended that so often as sheep was killed for the use of the family, I should be stripped and swathed up in the skin, warm as it was, flayed from the carcass of the animal. In this tartar-like habiliment, I remember lying upon the floor of the little parlour in the farmhouse, while my grandfather, a venerable old man with white hair, used every excitement tried to make me crawl.
In the borders, Scott listened to the stories of his Aunt Jenny and became besotted with border ballads and history, tales and traditions which would find their way in abundance in his poems and novels. Yet it wasn't only in the romance of the borders where Scott felt inspiration could be found. Even as a child, he discovered that in the city too, there were stories waiting to be discovered if one only knew where to look for them. Scott's school days played a huge part in this revelation, and so it is to the seed of Scott's schooling that we head next. From 1779, Scott attended the Royal High School, and this time in the buildings here at High School Yards. This itself is an interesting sight beyond the connection with Scott. Mary Queen of Scots' second husband, Henry Lord Darnley, was discovered murdered in the garden which once grew here. It's tempting to think that this is precisely the sort of grisly tale with grounding in reality for which Scott would gain the reputation of resident storyteller during his school years. He confessed that his own enthusiasm in stories at this time lay in the wonderful and the terrible, the common taste of children, and so the city's stories of murders and scandals would have been irresistible to a schoolboy storyteller such as Scott. Perhaps one of the most infamous was, of course, the notorious story of the cabinet maker turned thief by night Deacon Brodie, who was discovered and executed while Scott was still a teenager, a character who would go on to inspire another great character from Robert Louis Stevenson in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In later years, Scott reflected on his school days and his role as resident storyteller. He would say, "Among my companions, my good nature and a flow of ready imagination rendered me very popular. Boys are uncommonly just in their feelings and at least equally generous. My lameness and the efforts which I made to supply that disadvantage by making up in address what I wanted in activity engaged the latter principle in my favor. And in the winter play hours, when hard exercise was impossible, my tales used to assemble an admiring audience round Lucky Brown's fireside, and happy was he that could sit next to the inexhaustible narrator. I was also, though often negligent of my own task, always ready to assist my friends, and hence I had a little party of staunch partisans and adherents, stout of hand and heart, though somewhat dull of head, the very tools for raising a hero to eminence. So, on the whole, I made a brighter figure in the yards than in the class." So Scott certainly appears to have made his mark upon the yards, quite literally, because as I'm sure many of you know, he seems to have graffitied his name to just to the left of the main door as you go into the building, which is an interesting relic. Whether it's Scott himself or not, who knows? But Lucy, tell us a little bit more about Scott as a schoolboy and what he got up to during these years.
Well, as well as regaling his schoolfellows with stories as well, we know that throughout his life and indeed from a young age too, Scott was a really keen walker, and that he was instructed by his father actually to only walk so far as he would be able to be permitted from Edinburgh to be there and back within a day. So his geographical as well as the imaginative boundaries and the rambles that he would take there were reliant mainly on where he could reach within the city. So thankfully those were plentiful, as we're hearing a little bit about this evening, from tales of the Covenanters to Jacobite stories, or the more modern day narratives such as Deacon Brodie that you mentioned earlier, Nick, as well. So walking plays a big part too.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I believe that's Walter the dog, named after Walter Scott, barking in the background there, very fitting. So we're now going to travel to the very heart of some of those stories, to Edinburgh's Royal Mile. Now, this expansive thoroughfare must be one of the most recognisable streets in the world. It is a bold seam stretching all the way from the grand heights of Castle Rock right down to the foot of the mile and the palace of Holyrood House, where Scott would see King George IV in the first visit of a monarch to Scotland in nearly 200 years. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Many of the buildings and features of this famous street have, of course, changed since Scott's time. For example, we no longer see the old toll booth, the old Edinburgh prison, the Black Turnpike or guardhouse of the city provost, a building which Scott described as a long black snail, obscuring the grandeur of the streets in front of the Tron Kirk. The High Street would also have boasted a 4-storey tenement of Lucken booths, and you can see an image of these on your screen. These Lucken booths, or locked booths, were a building of market stalls which ran along the north side of St Giles Cathedral, and it was demolished in 1817. So despite these changes, in many ways, the Mile has retained its distinguishing characteristics for centuries. There is, in fact, a wonderful description of the Royal Mile found in the Abbott, Scott's 1820 novel set in 16th century Scotland during the reign of arguably the nation's most famous monarch, Mary Queen of Scots. Now, he had a very good reason for turning his pen to portray Mary when he did, having had a rather miserable reception to his novel The Monastery earlier that year. And he sought to avail himself of one of the city's best protagonists, as he outlined in the 1831 preface to the novel, in which he said, "There occurs in every country some peculiar historical characters which are, like a spell or charm, sovereign to excite curiosity and attract attention, since everyone in the slightest degree interested in the land to which they belong has heard much of them and longs to hear more. It was with these feelings that I ventured to awaken in a work of fiction the memory of Queen Mary, so interesting by her wit, her beauty, her misfortunes, and the mystery which still does, and probably always will, overhang her history. While most of the Abbott takes place elsewhere in Scotland, including at Lochleven Castle, the site of Mary's famous imprisonment and escape, in the following scene, which I'm going to ask Lucy to read, Mary's young page, Roland Graham, arrives in Edinburgh for the very first time, and we are treated to a view of the Royal Mile as seen through Roland's eyes, a view that I think you will agree is very recognisable to this day.
Thank you, Becky. And yes, hopefully we'll have no more guest vocal appearances from Puppy Walter. The principal street of Edinburgh was then, as now, one of the most spacious in Europe. The extreme height of the houses and the variety of Gothic gables and battlements and balconies by which the skyline on each side was crowned and terminated, together with the width of the street itself, might have struck with surprise even the more practised eye than that of the young Graham. The population, close packed within the walls of the city, and at this time increased by the number of the lords of the King's party who had thronged to Edinburgh to wait upon the Regent Murray, absolutely swarmed like bees on the wide and stately street. Instead of the shop windows, which are now calculated for the display of goods, the traders had their open booths projecting on the street, in which, as in the fashion of the modern bazaars, all was exposed which they had upon sale. And though the commodities were not of the richest kinds, yet Graham thought he beheld the wealth of the whole world in the various bales of Flanders cloth and the specimens of tapestry, and at other places the display of domestic utensils and pieces of plate struck him with wonder. The sight of the cutler's booth, furnished with swords and poignards, which were manufactured in Scotland, and with pieces of defensive armour imported from Flanders, added to his surprise, and at every step he found so much to admire and to gaze upon that Adam Woodcock had no little difficulty in prevailing on him to advance through such a scene of enchantment.
Thank you. So I think that's just such an evocative description, especially just now during the Fringe and the festival when there's so much going on the Mile. Now, many of Scott's stories start from this place in the heart of the city, with threads to be unravelled in many of the closes winding away from the central street. Indeed, it feels as though any close leading off the Mile might have had a good story at the end, and the picturesque Lady Stairs Close is no exception. Furthermore, a connection can be found in this close, which you can see images of on your screen just now, in Scott's novel The Bride of Lammermoor from 1819. The tragic tale of Lucy Ashton in Scott's novel is based upon the real-life tragedy of Janet Dalrymple, daughter of James Dalrymple, Viscount Stair, who was forced to marry against her will when she loved another. On her wedding day, she attempted the life of her husband and died just a few short weeks later. The connection comes as the house was once owned by Lady Stair, widow to Janet's brother, and so it's very likely this name would have suggested the story to Scott, who knew the tale well. Parliament Square and St Giles provided ample inspiration for stories and scenes from Scott's novels, including in his 1816 novel The Tale of Old Mortality, in which Scott drew upon personal experience and knowledge of rooms as an Edinburgh man of the law within the Parliament to depict scenes concerning the trials and torture of Covenanters. Further down the Royal Mile, Scott's stories continue to pour forth from passageways and from palaces. In his first novel, Waverley, set against the events of the 1745 Jacobite uprisings, wavering protagonist Edward Waverley is torn between his duty as a soldier of the Hanoverian army and the romance of the Jacobite cause, which he experiences on a period of leave spent in the Scottish Highlands. This head versus heart battle is brought to a crisis and a conversion when he meets Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, at the Palace of Holyrood House at the base of the Mile, where the prince set up court for 6 weeks in September 1745. Waverley is so charmed by the prince's person, so inspired by his manner of expression and chivalric presence, that he declares his allegiance there and then, naming him a prince to live and die under.
So carrying up the Royal Mile, here we are then at the heart of Midlothian, maybe the centre of some of the mythology around Walter Scott in Edinburgh. Built in the 15th century, the Tolbooth of Edinburgh, which we can see again in this 18th century drawing, was a grim and gruesome place. The building itself would have obscured the view that we have today, protruding out into the middle of the Royal Mile with its bulk. On the western side, parallel to the front of St. Giles, a further section was built at a significantly lower level, and this was the execution platform. Before this, public executions had most often taken place at the Market Cross on the other side of the cathedral. But the mounted platform created a theatrical, stage-like effect for the execution, which was, even into the 18th century, regarded as a form of spectacle. Some forms of torture involved chaining prisoners outside of the prison, as in a pillory, and often the heads of the most notorious prisoners would be pitched upon a spike outside the prison, visible to all that passed. When the Tolbooth was eventually demolished in 1817, and here we see an image attributed to Naismith of that demolition, great crowds assembled in order to witness the fall of this infamous building. Scott was among the spectators, having already ensured his possession of several relics of the day, including the great oak door of the prison, which he built high up on the wall at Abbotsford, which you'll know if you've been there, you've seen that, his home in the Scottish borders. Also 2 great iron locks and the gigantic set of keys from the Tolbooth. So let's think about the story that unfolds in The Heart of Midlothian, perhaps the greatest novel set in Edinburgh. These objects and the prison's dramatic history certainly resonated with Scott, as within a year of the prison's demolition, his novel of the same name, The Heart of Midlothian, was published in 1818. The novel follows the plight of Jeanie Deans and her younger sister, Effie, accused of infanticide. Unmarried, there's a strong suspicion that Effie has concealed her pregnancy and murdered her child in order to conceal her sexual impropriety. Pitying the young and beautiful girl, the officials offer Effie a final lifeline. If she can prove that she had communicated her pregnancy to someone, the person most close to her, she might avoid the sentence of death. Yet her sister, Jeanie, daughter of a staunch Cameronian and innately moral, cannot tell the lie that will save Effie, and instead confesses, alack, alack, she never breathed a word about it. But Jeanie is not the heartless sister that you may think, demonstrating not only her humanity, but also a surprisingly intricate knowledge of Scots law. While Effie languishes in the old Tolbooth of Edinburgh, Jeanie journeys down to London on foot, some 400 miles away, in order to seek a royal pardon. Meeting with Queen Caroline, Jeanie makes a heartfelt appeal to Her Majesty's sensibility, thinking all the while of her sister languishing here inside the desperate walls of the city Tolbooth. Effie's plight and Jeanie's journey emerged from a real story related to Scott, and it collides in the course of the novel with another, a particularly infamous Edinburgh story connected to the Heart of Midlothian. For Scott opens his novel with an account of the Porteous Riots in 1736. Events began when 2 housebreakers or thieves named Wilson and Robertson, imprisoned here and awaiting execution, made a final attempt to escape by filing down the iron bars of their cell. Alas, the plan was thwarted by the larger of the 2 men, Wilson, who attempted to squeeze his way out first, ignoring Robertson's suggestion that he, the smaller, should go first and help his mate from the outside. So the plan failed. And Wilson felt so guilty that on the day of the execution, he attacked the executioner so that his friend could run, and run Robertson did. Wilson's execution naturally stirred excitement and significant sympathy across the city, so much that the city guard was commanded to attend the execution, armed under the command of Captain Porteous. Let's pick up some images here. When the time came, Wilson's execution was awaited with bated breath and attended by thousands. Under the watchful eye of Porteous, the execution went ahead. But afterwards, tensions mounted and unrest followed, culminating in the open fire of the city guard and the death of a number at the scene. Incensed by shooting into the crowd, the people demanded justice, and later that same day, Porteous was imprisoned, somewhat ironically, in the Tolbooth. and later charged with murder. Yet before the sentence of the law could be carried out, a crowd stormed the old toll booth, and what followed is best described by Scott himself. Reality and fiction collide as Porteous is borne down from the prison through the West Bow to the grass market. Clergyman Reuben Butler, Jeannie's fiancé, is called upon to give him the last rites, witnessing in the process the following menacing scene, which Lucy will read to us.
Procession now moved forward with a slow and determined pace. It was enlightened by many blazing lights and torches, for the actors of this work were so far from affecting any secrecy on the occasion that they seemed even to court observation. Their principal leaders kept close to the person of the prisoner, whose pallid yet stubborn features were seen distinctly by the torchlight, as his person was raised considerably above the concourse which thronged about him. Those who bore swords, muskets, and battle axes marched on either side, as if forming a regular guard to the procession. The windows, as they went along, were filled with the inhabitants whose slumbers had been broken by this unusual disturbance. Some of the spectators muttered accents of encouragement, but in general they were so much appalled by a sight of so strange and audacious that they looked on with a sort of stupefied astonishment. No one offered by act or word the slightest interruption. As they descended the bow towards the fatal spot where they designed to complete their purpose, it was suggested that there should be a rope in readiness. For this purpose, the booth of a man who dealt in cordage was forced open, and a coil of rope fit for their purposes was selected to serve as a halter. And the dealer the next morning found that a guinea had been left on his counter in exchange, so anxious were the perpetrators of this daring action to show that they mediated not the slightest wrong or infraction of the law, excepting so far as Porteous himself was concerned. Leading or carrying along with them in this determined and regular manner the object of their vengeance, they at length reached the place of common execution, the scene of his crime and the destined spot of his sufferings. Several of the rioters, if they should not rather be described as conspirators, endeavoured to remove the stone which filled up the socket in which the end of the fatal tree was sunk when it was erected for its fatal purpose. Others sought for the means of constructing a temporary gibbet, the place in which the gallows itself was deposited being reported too secure to be forced. Without much loss of time, Butler endeavoured to avail himself of the delay afforded by these circumstances to turn the people away from their desperate designs.
So we leave behind these grim tales of prisons and prison inmates to turn to tales connected with the courthouse and also Scott's own legal profession behind St Giles Cathedral in Parliament Square. Son of a writer to the signet and himself a man of the law, both in youth and in adulthood, Scott would have spent a great deal of time in this central section of the Royal Mile, the legal heart of the city. Scott's school days ended at the rather tender age of 12 when he entered the University of Edinburgh studying classics, and later Scots law under David Hume, nephew of the philosopher. He was apprenticed to his father's office at the age of 15, although this apprenticeship was at several times interrupted by Scott's abrupt and by all accounts rather worrying growth spurts, for which one doctor interestingly prescribed several months of vegetarianism as a cure. Lucy, could you tell us something about the life of a young advocate in the Edinburgh of Scott's day?
Yes, and I can only imagine what that cure of vegetarianism, how that prescription was received. But yes, as a young advocate in Edinburgh in the late 18th century, Scott would have daily roamed the streets, and as we can see on the screen here as well, and would have made their daily walk from the faculty and the Parliament. And these streets would have also been lined with public houses and taverns of frequently rather questionable status, yet they would have been the very inns and rooms in which famous philosophers, lawyers, writers were to be found conversing and, of course, making merry and much more besides. Scott's youthful years in the Enlightenment Edinburgh amid the hubbub of the law courts and the buzz of society has made him no stranger to this aspect of this gentlemanly profession. An example of what this may have involved appears in a note found in Scott's 1824 novel Red Gauntlet, describing a daily jaunt to an Enlightenment Edinburgh institution, John's Coffee House. Once located just a few paces away here at the eastern end of Parliament Square, and you can see various coffee shops and shop fronts on the screen here. So in this description, in this location, a young gentleman would take a bumper dram of brandy to be taken promptly at midday, known as the Meridian. And as I say, I'll read out Scott's description of this, taken from Red Gauntlet. This small, dark coffee house, now burnt down, was the resort of such writers and clerks belonging to the Parliament House above 30 years ago as retained the ancient Scottish custom of a meridian, as it was called, or a noontime dram of spirits. If their proceedings were watched, they might be seen to turn fidgety about the hour of noon and exchange looks with one another from their separate desks, till at length some one of the formal and dignified presence assumed the honour of leading the band, when away they went, threading the crowd like a string of wild fowl, crossed the square or close, and following each other into the coffee house, received in turn from the hand of the waiter the meridian, which was placed ready at the bar. This they did day by day, and although they did not speak to each other, they seemed to attach a degree of sociability in performing this ceremony in company.
I think we ought to bring something like that back to the working life when we all get back to it in future days. Now, we know that Scott was called to office as advocate in 1792 at the age of 21. And he retained for the next 30 years of his life a professional capacity in law. For a good part of that professional life, Parliament House would have been something of a centre. The oldest part of the building is Parliament Hall, completed in 1639, and the Advocates' Library, founded in 1682. It stands behind St Giles Cathedral, having once been the meeting ground of great philosophers, lawyers, religious reformers, and radicals of Edinburgh. Beneath what is now the car park is the former kirkyard of St Giles, which is where the Protestant leader of the Scottish Reformation and one-time minister of St Giles, John Knox, is buried. As the site of so much of Edinburgh's history, the young Scot would no doubt have been delighted by the imaginative possibilities that opened up to him when merely winding his way into work, especially as, sadly, the monotony of everyday court life did not suit Scott. He found the work to be restrictive, and he referred to his profession as a prison house. The vignettes of court life, the intricacies of the cases, the matters of history, social order, and justice would be of more interest to him than the actual practice of law. Therefore, though they shared a profession, there was a dramatic difference between the expectations and passions of Scott Senior and Junior. The relationship between father and son can be read rather closely in the pages of Scott's novel Red Gauntlet. Now, in this work, young Darcy Latimer becomes the unsuspecting pawn in a plan to lead a fictional final Jacobite uprising in 1765 in the name of the, by then rather old, young pretender Bonnie Prince Charlie. Darcy's friend Alan Fairford undertakes to rescue his friend, but in order to do so, he must escape his father's plans to launch his son's legal profession with the case of the eccentric Peter Peeble. Like Scott Jr., Fairford is a hardworking, extremely loyal son. Like Scott Sr., his father is not a man to be trifled with when it comes to the law. Just such a conversation as this one we're going to read to you now between Alan and his father might have occurred between Scott and his own father after a long day at work.
Okay, here we go. I'm the father. Alan, you now wear a gown. You have opened a shop, as we would say of a more mechanical profession, and doubtless you think the floor of the courts is strewed with guineas, and that you have only to stoop down and gather them.
I hope I am sensible, sir, that I have some knowledge and practice to acquire and must stoop for that in the first place.
It's well said, very well said. If it be well acted up to, stoop to get knowledge and practice is the very word. You know very well, Alan, that in the other faculty who study the ars medendi, before the young doctor gets to the bedsides of palaces, he must, as they call it, walk the hospitals and cure Lazarus of his sores before he be admitted to prescribe for divers when he has gout or indigestion.
I am aware, sir, that...
Quish! Do not interrupt the court. Well, also the surgeons have a useful practice by which they put their apprentices to work upon senseless dead bodies, to which, as they can do no good, so they certainly can do as little harm, while at the same time the tyro or apprentice gains experience and becomes fit to whip off a leg or arm from a living subject as cleanly as you would slice an onion.
I believe I guess your meaning, sir, and were it not for a very particular engagement...
Do not speak to me of engagements, but whisht, there's a good lad. Do not interrupt the court. Well, you'll have to excuse our dramatic interlude there, and we will move on with our story we're walking up the Royal Mile now to Edinburgh's Castle Esplanade. So upon rediscovery in 1819, it was over 100 years since the sceptre of Scotland had performed its final duty, after which it had been deposited in a strong box in a chest of uncertain location in Edinburgh Castle, along with other items making up the honours of Scotland, to be famously discovered by Sir Walter Scott. So Lucy, tell us a little bit more about the honours. Is it possible that they were actually lost?
I think perhaps not. I think they were secretly people didn't know where they were, but certainly Scott is the one to put things in motion and to actually go and seek them and seek that sort of next chapter in their story. But this is certainly not the first chapter of their story. They've got a rather thrilling history. The story of the honours actually spanned over many centuries. Some of the chapters, they were spent concealed within the walls of Dunnottar Castle or buried under the paving slabs under the floor of Kenneth Parish Church as well, for their safekeeping and preservation against destruction. So really sort of very Gothic kind of storytelling is involved in the story of the honours. And as to say, though, it's tempting to think that they spent a century hidden away in secrecy, concealed where nobody knew where they were. In reality, it was well known that they were in Edinburgh Castle. But over the course of that 100 years, it was only Scott who decided that actually he would investigate further and bring them out of obscurity and into public view. And he first did that by bringing a petition to the then Prince Regent and future King George IV. He brought a petition to the Prince Regent asking if he could lead that expedition, that adventure into Edinburgh Castle to find the honours, and permission was granted, and on the 4th of February 1818 they were discovered with some drama as they sort of prized open this dusty old chest, and there were the honours of Scotland, and they went on to public display just 1 year later, and of course they've remained on public display to this day.
All wonderfully stage managed by the great man. And he wrote on that day to a friend, "My dear Crocker, I promised I would add something to my report of yesterday, and yet I find I have but little to say. The extreme solemnity of opening sealed doors of oak and iron, and finally breaking open a chest which had been shut since the 7th of March 1707, about 111 years, gave a sort of interest to our researches, which I can hardly express to you, and it would be very difficult to describe the intense eagerness with which we watched the rising of the lid of the chest and the progress of the workmen in breaking it open, which was neither an easy nor a speedy task. It sounded very hollow when they worked on it with their tools, and I began to lean to your faction of the little faiths. However, I never could assign any probable or feasible reason for withdrawing these memorials of ancient independence. And my doubts rather arose from the conviction that many absurd things are done in public, as well as in private life, merely out of a hasty impression of passion or resentment. For it was evident the removal of the regalia might have greatly irritated people's minds and offered a fair pretext of breaking the union, which for 30 years was the predominant wish of the Scottish nation. As well as leading the band of men charged with discovery of the regalia, In true Scot fashion, the author also took it upon himself to communicate this Edinburgh tale to the people of Scotland in the form of a pamphlet titled Description of the Regalia of Scotland in 1819. And shortly afterwards, he was created a baronet for his part in the proceedings, becoming Sir Walter Scott in London in April 1820. His correspondence with the then Prince Regent was to continue into his reign as George IV, and the friendship culminated in the grand spectacle of 1822. In the first visit of a reigning monarch to Scotland in nearly 200 years, organised by Sir Walter Scott, the man, George IV said upon his arrival, in Scotland I most wish to see.
Sadly, this seemingly perpetual climb of fame and fortune was not set to last for Scott. Just a few years later, in 1825, he fell foul of a nationwide banking crisis beset with speculation, loans and lending, of which he himself was a part. Together with his publisher, Archibald Constable, Scott was called to pay extraordinary amounts of debt and was tantamount to bankrupt. But it was through the tremendous goodwill from friends, fans and creditors that Scott was able to put his beloved house, Abbotsford, in trust, and through sheer determination committed himself to the gargantuan task of writing himself out of debt, stating, "My own right hand shall do it." Scott wrote furiously in the years that followed, publishing works such as the Chronicles of the Canongate and the Fair Maid of Perth, and writing introductions for his entire corpus for the magnum opus edition of the Waverley novels. By the time of his death in 1832, Scott had been able to work off roughly half of the debt that besieged him. The remaining was cleared 15 years after his death by the sale of his remaining copyrights. So though his final years were besieged with struggle, hard work, personal illness and grief, including the loss of his wife Charlotte in 1826, the year of his ruin, still centuries later, the name of Scott is still intricately intertwined with Edinburgh's and Scotland's history, geography and its very character. And when you stand somewhere like the Esplanade, which we would encourage you to visit, thinking about Scott's legacy, with a sort of spectacular view of the Scott Monument and so many of the sites, the Heart of Midlothian, that you see from every side, it's very hard not to see how much of Scott remains written into the very fabric of Edinburgh to this day.
Thank you, Becky. So time for questions. If you do have any questions for us or for Dr. Lucy, please just pop those in the Q&A. One that I did receive earlier, which is about Scott and tourism, really. And obviously tourism's in the news, sustainable tourism, and we're looking forward in many ways to the return of tourists to Scotland and Edinburgh, for some of us anyway. But Scott seems to have played a role in making Scotland a popular tourism destination. Is that something that you've seen in your studies of the man, Lucy? What role do you think he played in creating the sort of tourist industry that we see today in Scotland?
Absolutely. I think without a doubt, Scott plays a really crucial part in making Scotland or enhancing Scotland as a popular tourist destination. And we know that once again, it goes back to that connection between place and story. And many of the places that Scott wrote about became places that people visited to see the site of Scott's stories. So for example, one that springs to mind is Melrose Abbey. Now that was already a popular tourist destination through in the borders. It's already a popular tourist destination, but when Scott writes about it, it takes on a different aspect, a different character, and becomes a site of literary tourism. And we know that people did all sorts of things, that they'd visit the Abbey by night to see it as it was in Scott's poem. So there's, across Scotland, you've got different landscapes and different monuments and castles and abbeys and sites which people would visit to see the landscape written about by Scott. So whether that's the borders or the Trossachs, connected with the poem The Lady of the Lake, as I say, the borders with The Lay of the Last Minstrel and poems like that. And then the novels we've been talking about this evening as well. And that's something that definitely carries on after Scott's death, and I would say maybe its peak in the Victorian period as well.
But Scott didn't travel abroad much himself, though, did he? And I know one of our former trustees of Edinburgh World Heritage, Ian Gordon Brown, has recently published a book about Scott's relationship with the Grand Tour. And he seems to have preferred staying at home rather than actually experiencing the places abroad that were so famous at the time.
Absolutely, as well. I was lucky enough to go to a talk recently all about that by Ian Gordon Brown, and looking forward to reading that book as well. But yes, I think it seems to have been a bit of a conflict for Scott, because he didn't travel much abroad himself. And as we heard earlier, when he was a young man, he was really restricted in where he could travel. And I believe I'm right in saying actually his marriage was one of the first occasions when either he or his father had actually left Edinburgh for a considerable period of time. But although Scott didn't travel much himself, I think there was a conflict between sort of liking to be at home and stay where he was, but then a thirst to travel, which never really was fulfilled. Although having said that, he did make some rather momentous journeys, including he travelled to the field of the Battle of Waterloo within 6 weeks of the battle having concluded. So I think in that instance, he clearly felt that he would be missing the opportunity to see a historical moment as it played out, and so that was the impetus for his travel on that occasion, but certainly not as much as you might expect for Scott and his sort of natural curiosity and things like that.
One other question that's popped in is about his relationship with his father and whether it improved during his career. I'm not sure at what year his father died, but did his father live long enough to see him achieve fame, and what happened to their relationship? Do we have any information on that?
To my shame, I actually can't recall off the top of my head when his father did pass away, and I think from that wonderful dramatic scene that we heard earlier, which is of course Alan Fairford and his father, there was certainly the same for Scott. There was certainly that respect and affection, with a difference of temperament and a difference perhaps of perspective as well. And so I think they did get on, but just weren't quite reading from the same page, if you like, if you'll permit a literary kind of allusion there. But I say, to my shame, I can't remember off the top of my head when his father did pass away. He certainly was saw Scott married at the end of the 18th century.
Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to a close. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to Lucy for helping us this evening, and also for you for joining us, as well as for those people that were with us last week for our actual tour of the Old Town. It's been a tremendous, enjoyable week of celebrating the life of one of Scotland's greatest sons. So all it remains for me to do is just to tell you a little bit about our next event. We're looking forward very much to start our own celebrations as a charity. 1971 marked the establishment of the Newtown Conservation Committee, which was really the parent organisation of Edinburgh World Heritage. And so we will have a lecture on Thursday, the 9th of September at St Andrew's Kirk in George Street, entitled A Miracle in Stone, which is a lecture to celebrate 50 years of conservation. And it's an extraordinary story, the story really of saving the new town and then going on to conserve many of the buildings in the old town as well. So we do hope you'll join us for that special event. It's a free event for members and for our special guests. So we're looking forward to seeing you all then. If you're not a member, do consider joining, and we'll pop an invitation to you via email for that event. So hope to see you then. And in the meantime, enjoy your reading of Scott, everyone. And my next book, the one I haven't read, is The Abbott. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck in with The Abbott. But thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at our next event. Good night.